He's already dead. That's what the climbers walking past him believe. Lying face down in the snow on Mount Everest, his body frozen solid, his skin the color of wax. Nobody stops. Nobody checks twice. Why would they? At 26,000 feet, in the middle of one of the worst storms the mountain has ever seen, a body in the snow is just a body. And yet, hours later, that same man stands up. He walks. He survives a night that killed better climbers than him, with no oxygen, no shelter, temperatures cold enough to freeze exposed flesh in minutes. His name is Beck Weathers, and what happened to him on Everest in the spring of 1996 is one of the most astonishing survival stories ever recorded. Beck Weathers wasn't a professional mountaineer. He was a pathologist from Dallas, Texas, a man in his mid-40s who built a quiet, comfortable life around his medical practice, his wife Peach, and his 2 kids. But somewhere along the way, Beck had caught the climbing bug, the kind of obsession that starts small and grows until it consumes weekends, vacations, and eventually most of a person's identity. He'd already climbed 6 of the 7 summits, the highest peaks on each continent. Only one was left, the big one, Everest. In the spring of 1996, Beck joined an expedition led by a New Zealand guide named Rob Hall, one of the most respected commercial climbing operators in the world. Hall's company, Adventure Consultants, had a reputation for getting paying clients to the summit and back safely. And Beck, along with a handful of other climbers from around the world, put his trust and a great deal of money into that promise. What none of them could have known was that this particular expedition would become one of the deadliest in the mountain's history, a disaster so severe it would later be chronicled in best-selling books and major films. The plan seemed sound enough on paper. Climb up through a series of camps, acclimatizing along the way, and make a final push for the summit on a clear weather window in early May. Beck had trained hard. He was fit, determined, and by all accounts, deeply focused on finally checking this last box on a list that had taken him years to complete. Nothing about the morning of May 10th, 1996, felt like the beginning of a tragedy. The sky was clear. The wind was calm. It looked for a few precious hours like it might be a perfect day to stand on top of the world. But something was already going wrong, and it wasn't the weather. Not yet. Everest, above the higher camps, is often called the death zone for a reason. Above 26,000 feet, the air holds so little oxygen that the human body begins actively dying, cell by cell, no matter how fit or prepared a climber might be. Every extra minute spent up there without supplemental oxygen accelerates the damage. Judgment blurs. Movement slow. And on that morning, the crowds of climbers pushing toward the summit created a bottleneck at a rocky feature called the Hillary Step, a narrow, technical passage near the very top. Climbers were forced to wait in a queue, burning through their limited oxygen supplies and their limited time in air that was actively killing them. Beck Weathers had a serious problem brewing that had nothing to do with the crowds. His eyesight had started to fail him. He'd had radial keratotomy surgery years earlier to correct his vision, a procedure that, unbeknownst to him, made his eyes extremely vulnerable to the effects of extreme altitude. As he climbed higher, his vision began to blur, then narrow, then blur badly enough that the world in front of him turned into a wash of white and gray. He could barely see his own hands in front of his face. Beck made the responsible choice, the kind of choice that should have saved his life outright. He told Rob Hall he couldn't safely continue, and Hall instructed him to wait right where he was, at a spot known as the balcony, roughly 27,000 feet up the mountain. Hall told him to stay put, that he'd collect him on the way back down from the summit. Beck agreed. He sat down in the snow to wait, trusting that help was only a few hours away. Those few hours would turn into one of the longest, most brutal ordeals a human being has ever survived. While Beck waited, motionless, his blood sugar dropping and his body temperature falling with every passing minute, the weather on Everest turned violent with terrifying speed. A storm rolled in from the base of the mountain, whipping snow sideways in blinding sheets, dropping visibility to almost nothing, and sending wind gusts tearing across the upper slopes hard enough to knock a person flat. Climbers who'd been making their triumphant descent from the summit suddenly found themselves fighting just to find the fixed ropes that marked the safe path down. People who knew this mountain intimately were getting lost within feet of camp. Somewhere in that chaos, Rob Hall never made it back to collect Beck Weathers. Hall himself became trapped near the summit with another climber in trouble, and in a decision that would ultimately cost him his own life, he refused to abandon his client. Down below, at the balcony, Beck sat alone in the storm, his vision gone, his body shutting down, with no idea that the man who'd promised to come back for him was fighting his own losing battle higher up the mountain. Other climbers eventually found Beck and helped guide him, virtually blind, stumbling and half-conscious, back toward the high camp. But the storm had grown so fierce, and the group so disoriented, that they became lost only a few hundred yards from the tents that could have saved them. Just a few hundred yards, and they might as well have been miles away. Wind screamed around them at speeds that made standing upright a fight. Snow blasted horizontally, stinging any bare skin, coating goggles and eyelashes with ice. Voices got swallowed instantly by the wind. In that whiteout, a group of exhausted, oxygen-starved climbers had no choice but to do the only thing that might keep them alive. They huddled together in the open, in the middle of the storm, and waited for a break in the weather that might never come. Beck Weathers lay down in that huddle, and slowly his body began to give up. Hypothermia doesn't announce itself the way people expect. It creeps in cold and quiet, stealing coordination first, then speech, then the ability to keep your eyes open. Beck's core temperature dropped further and further as the night dragged on, his exposed skin freezing in the brutal wind chill, his mind slipping in and out of consciousness. At some point, deep in that storm, his body simply couldn't fight anymore, and he went still. When rescuers finally managed to reach the stranded group later that night, they found several people barely alive, shivering, some able to walk with help. And they found Beck Weathers, lying motionless in the snow, unresponsive, his skin frozen and pale. They checked him and found no clear signs of life worth risking further rescue effort over. In the brutal calculus of a mountain rescue in a raging storm, with limited strength and oxygen and other survivors who still had a chance, a decision was made. Beck Weathers was left behind, presumed dead. Word traveled down the mountain and eventually across the world. In Dallas, Texas, Beck's wife Peach received a phone call informing her that her husband hadn't survived the storm on Everest. She began the horrifying process of accepting that her husband was gone, that a mountain thousands of miles away had taken him just short of the summit he'd trained years to reach. But on that exposed ridge, Beck Weathers wasn't dead. He was locked in a place beyond consciousness, his body so cold and deprived of oxygen that every normal function had slowed to something barely registering as alive. And then, hours after he'd been left in the snow, hours after his own wife had been told he was gone, something inside him fought back. He later described it as a dream, though dream doesn't quite capture what happened. Lying there in the snow, on the edge of death, he says he had a vision of his family, his wife, his children, waiting for him back home. And in that vision, something clicked into place, some final, stubborn thread of will that refused to let go. His eyes opened. Imagine that moment. A man waking from what should have been his final sleep, alone on the side of the tallest mountain on earth, buried partly in snow, his body screaming in ways he could barely process. No rescuers in sight. No camp visible. Nothing but white in every direction and cold that had already taken most of what he had left to give. He couldn't see clearly. His hands, exposed for hours in temperatures far below freezing, were frozen solid, curled useless. The physical toll of that night in the storm became fully clear once doctors examined him. The frostbite had gone deep, deep enough that there was no saving what had